All right, welcome back. It's been a little while, but we're back today to talk about the role of Canada in Latin America, particularly the country of Brazil during the Second World War. On the paper 3 exam, you may very well have to write about the impacts of World War II made by two nations in the Americas. So, of course, you can choose the United States, but you now need to fill in with Canada or Brazil as a second option. So we're going to start talking about Canada first. And Canada's in the war from the very beginning. As a former colony and current member of the British Commonwealth, which doesn't really mean anything except for it's a member of the club of nations that used to be a part of the British Empire and kind of left peacefully. The United States is not a Commonwealth member. We didn't leave too peacefully. The Canadian Parliament would support a declaration of war only about a week after Britain itself declared war on Germany. So that's back in September of 1939. Canadian forces on the land, the air, and the sea will play essential roles in the European theater, and Canadian manufacturing is going to support Allied efforts throughout the war. So we're going to talk about each of the branches of the Canadian military first and recognize with all of them, they all start off incredibly small. Canada doesn't need much of a military. It's got no threats. It's got a Pacific Ocean to its west. It's got an Atlantic Ocean to its east. It's got a friendly United States to its south. Canada doesn't need much of a military, so they don't have much of a military at the outset of World War II. So their Air Force, for example, the Royal Canadian Air Force, incredibly small at the outset of the war, only 4,000 airmen, less than a few hundred planes. But they take part in what's called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which will lead to the training of tens of thousands of pilots, half of which were Canadian. The Royal Canadian Air Force will also play an important role in the liberation of Europe, flying supply missions, bombing, and support missions. By the end of the war, Canadian manufacturers had produced over 16,000 aircraft to be used in the war effort. The Canadian Navy was also involved, again, very small at the outset of the war with only 15 ships and 1,800 sailors, but this will increase to over 400 ships to become the third largest Navy in the Allied forces. It's going to serve as convoy support and anti-submarine action in the long-running Battle of the Atlantic. The Canadian Army, again, incredibly small at the start of the war, only 5,000 men, only 16 tanks to the Army's name. It would begin combat in the spring of 1940, infamously taking part in what is known as the Dieppe Raid in August of 1942. And this is considered to be one of the darkest days in the history of the Canadian military. This was meant to be a deceptive raid to distract Germans from other theaters and as a test of amphibious strategies that might be used later in the war. The goal was to invade, capture, hold, and then withdraw from this town of Dieppe. But the Canadian forces will lose the element of surprise in the channel. German guns will neutralize naval support that the invasion force was supposed to receive. And in the end, only 2,000 of the 5,000 Canadians that entered would return. The Canadian Army would also take part in action in both Sicily and Italy and at the D-Day invasions, where Canadian forces would take Juno Beach in the Normandy landings. Naval and Royal Canadian Air Forces also supported the invasion. And by the end of the war, over 45,000 Canadians were killed in the war, which per capita, because Canada has a much smaller population than the United States, was a bigger cost in the war than the United States would face. Canada was also instrumental in its diplomatic and manufacturing actions during the war. Canada obviously had long, close connections with the UK, and at the outset of the war and through the duration, Canada would supply hundreds of millions of dollars in loans for war materials to the UK. Canada, obviously, due to its close proximity, had a close relationship with the United States as well. In August of 1940, the US and Canada agreed to a joint defense of North America. This is before the US even joined the war. In April of 1941, with what was known as the Hyde Park Declaration, it's going to link Canadian manufacturing with the American Lend-Lease Act. And Canada will also support the Soviet Union following the Soviet invasion by Germany. Now let's turn our page to the south and look at Brazil in the Second World War. Now Brazil has been long taking part in this new good neighbor policy with the United States, but remember that was all about staying neutral in war. It didn't compel anybody to get involved in a war, and so Franklin Roosevelt's going to put on a full court press to get Brazil and their president Getulio Vargas to commit troops to the war effort. Um, the President Roosevelt would promise a stronger post-war position for Brazil, but Vargas was very concerned that he had his own rivals in Latin America, like Argentina, and he didn't want to expose himself to weakness by getting involved in a European war that may not have impacted him directly. Brazil also had been fostering closer relations with Germany through trade and export through the 1930s. So it was not a foregone conclusion that Brazil would join the war effort. In fact, Vargas would take what was known as a pendulum policy, where he would remain neutral, but swing between the United States and Germany for exports, looking to gain from both sides of the war, kind of like what the United States was doing at the beginning of World War One. But the naval war in the Atlantic, what is known as the Battle of the Atlantic, and Germany's attempt to put a blockade on any shipments making their way to the UK would ultimately push Brazil to join the war effort, as Brazil started to see a lot of its merchant vessels sunk by German U-boats. Brazil would break diplomatic relations with Germany in January of 1942. Notice this is just 1 month after Pearl Harbor. The United States will then start sending lend-lease aid to Brazil. In May of 1942, the US and Brazil will agree to begin to make exchanges of trade, of weapons and raw materials. But then as U-boat activity would increase and Brazil is losing more merchant ships, it's pushing Brazilian public sentiment against Germany and on the side of the Allies. Brazil will declare war on Germany in August of 1942. The United States is going to take responsibility for defending the Brazilian coastline, and the nation of Brazil will allow the United States to establish a naval and air base presence on their coast. And this is going to be instrumental to provide logistical aid to the nearby North African campaign, as Brazil is much closer to North Africa than the United States is. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force will take part in the war. It's going to be the only Latin American nation to send combat soldiers into World War II. In 1944, the FEB is going to be sent to Italy and will fight alongside US troops in the Italian campaign. The Brazilian Air Force will also fly hundreds of missions in Europe, and the Brazilian Navy, using American ships, will take part in the Battle of the Atlantic against the German Navy and they will, along the course of their action, sink dozens of German U-boats. So an important role to be played by both Brazil and Canada. And now you're going to be able to write a little bit about either of those on your IB exam. We'll talk about you next time.